Um, you're very welcome to the second morning session. My name's Eugene Black. I work for the Sandbox team as part of Cisco DeveloperNet. So I just want to get something just on your background first, just so you know who I'm actually talking to. So what's your background? Network engineering, collaboration, pretty much. Has anybody ever used the DevNet Sandbox to do anything? Thank you. Anybody else? We just probably got about one or two. Okay, so I'm just going to pitch it at a very sort of instructive level. So what I'm going to do is give you a quick overview of what actually DevNet actually is. I just see the one gentleman down there who's probably used it, so to give you an idea of what it is. What is the DevNet Sandbox and how that actually fits in with the overall DevNet policy. We're going to look at some types of sandbox labs, so we're going to explain actually what that actually is. And I'm going to attempt to do essentially a demo of some of the sandbox labs. Now, the only issue with that is, I tried this out last night, just because I was going to use the local internet here, so there may be issues, but I do have enough screenshots to give you an idea of actually how that's actually going to work. Sandbox at the event at Cisco Live is actually just right beside us here on my right, your left. In there you can actually talk to a number of other sandbox engineers that you can actually talk to. It's worth visiting. There's actually a prize to actually build an actual laptop and actually access some of the stuff that I'm actually going to do. So you're probably more interested than probably looking at me. We're going to do a quick wrap up. And then, if we have time, we can take any questions. But if we do run out a bit out of time, I said the booth is actually over here. Does that make sense? Get the general feel? So try and keep it on to schedule. So just to give you an idea of what actually DevNet does, right? So the whole thing is basically DeveloperNet. What developers want is essentially to code. That's the primary function. Also, and even myself, is how do we actually learn about new Cisco technologies? How do we learn about APIs? How do we actually find out new things and whatever? Useful thing is, how do we actually connect with, it's very difficult if you're doing this yourself, so you actually need a wide community that you can actually interact with. So there's a whole essentially Cisco community actually built around this. And also we need to inspire people, somebody come up with a really good application using basically Cisco technology. So that's the whole premise of it, whatever. What I'm going to do is, so I've just talked about, so in terms of learning, just mention technologies and API. A very good site is the Learning Labs. Anybody use learninglabs.cisco.com? Yeah, how do you find it? It's good. If it's any consolation, I actually use it myself. So some technologies that I come from a networking background, but something maybe on IoT, collaboration or security, I actually use it myself because I find it's just really well designed to actually use it. Things like technologies and APIs, probably all familiar with, is actually how to use it. Now the one I'm going to primarily talk about today is in terms of the Sandbox. Sandbox specifically designed for coding. So this is pretty much sort of developer focused, because what developers want is basically access to Cisco technology without actually having to get Cisco equipment. So we talk about that in more detail. Talked a little bit about in terms of Inspire. So we have things like innovations is what it's all about. People coming up with really good applications, sharing that actually with the community. And we have specific events to do that, namely the DevNet creation events. So there's more information that we talk about that later on. And the more important thing is you got to share the information. So it's all about community. It's all about talking to people. Events like this in terms of Cisco Live, sharing ideas and so forth. So this is how we make it more interesting. It's not by yourself. You're not isolated out doing that. So that gives you an overall view of what actually DevNet actually is. But I'm primarily going to essentially talk on the DevNet Sandbox piece. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so that's just more or less a summary of what I actually talked about. Basically all about development communities, how to get APIs, how to get hands on. So the important thing is here, how do you get your hands on the Cisco technology? Why do you think that would be a good idea? What's the big problem, do you think, actually getting hands on Cisco technology? Number one issue getting access to technology. Anyone? Yep, that's the big one, all right. So we'll talk a little bit more about that anyway. Okay, so this is quite a nice slide. It shows you actually where all of these actually fit in. Primarily going to talk about the sandbox, as I said. So primarily the sandbox is how do I actually, it's all very well having these technologies, but how do I actually get access to it? And I think that's primarily what you actually want to find out from this session. The other things in terms of learning tracks, I think the gentleman down there mentioned it, that's a very, very good site. You can find anything you need to do there, literally just need to sign up and you're good to go there. We talked about what it is and what to use, talked about community, we talked about support, and good thing is, and I find useful because I've come from a networking environment where I had no previous sort of coding experience, so when I started to use Python, started to use language, I have no idea. So very good repositories in terms of the sample code and documentation, which is invaluable because that just helps to make learning so much easier. Okay, so we're going to get to the meat of the matter. So we're going to talk about essentially DevNet Sandbox. And the goal is when we talk about a thing called a hello world, right? The goal is what you want to do is basically access your first hello in 15 minutes. That's the objective of actually having the sandbox. And the problem is with that, if you want to basically develop against any of the Cisco technologies, the biggest problem is ordering a device. Who's ever ordered any devices? What's the major problems with that? Anybody? Usually finds delay in ordering equipment, may not be necessarily the right equipment. Obviously costing is another thing. So the challenges that essentially developers, and the section you guys face is, Cisco technology is great, but how do I actually get access to it? And that's primarily whatever. So you mightn't be aware of, but the Sandbox essentially is a free 24/7 service. So primarily if you're from a developer focus, what you actually get access to is free access to technology products, and that covers the whole range of Cisco technology products. Anything from networking to collaboration, to security, to IoT then. And the big thing, as you've probably seen there, it's free 24/7 access. All you really have to do is actually sign up for this here. What we do, and again, my role in terms of a sandbox engineer is we actually host a lot of these environments. So we have 2 sites in the world that actually do this. One's based in Galway in Ireland, and the other's based in San Jose. So we actually host all the technologies that people can actually access. You can get it from any web-enabled device. You can use your Cisco ID, you can use Google, you can use Facebook, any type of access that you actually need. And the important thing is it's a free and self-service to go on whatever. So that's what appeals to people, that the common complaint is, I want to maybe look at something like, for example, a networking node with maybe iOS XR, 9Ks or whatever. Not everybody's got access to that type of technology. So from this, we actually host it. We take all the trouble out of doing that, pre-configure it, put IP addresses, do all that type of stuff. So all you have to do from a developer perspective is simply just actually to log into it. Okay, just to give you an idea, in case you're aware, we actually have currently 76 technology labs, and that encompasses the whole Cisco technology. Bulk of it is in, obviously, because obviously Cisco is a networking company, a lot of networking technologies, a lot of IoT, got collaboration, security, and all the other hosted technologies. So there's plenty to choose from there in terms of what you actually need to do. The impressive thing is there, and I just checked this before I actually came, we've currently have 65,000 users registered basically in the developer Cisco DevNet, and a number of 17,000 companies. But the most impressive one there in terms of is 172 years in terms of reservation. Now I'll talk a bit more about reservations. So the whole idea is that when you actually book a sandbox lab, you actually get a reservation time period, right? The maximum of that is actually 7 days. So you can well imagine with 172 years, there's been quite a lot of activity in terms of reservations there. So those are just some statistics, just to give you an idea of what it's actually like then. Any comments on that, or did you think that was roughly in line with what your expectations were, or did you think it'd be more or less? So this is figure is actually growing. The idea is to try and push that as much as we can, because obviously everybody wants to use it. I did mention that we have a number of technologies. So this is all the, just give you more idea. So IoT, I'm not going to read them all, but this is the technologies that we actually do on the sandbox. More, some less and some more, because obviously the business units that actually want to get us on, we need to work with them closely, and they actually bring this on board. So far, we've managed to accommodate a net share between basically the 76 sandboxes. All right. So just to reiterate, just the number of actual sandbox labs. Now, I'm not going to actually read all of this, but just to give you a more deep dive, this is the type of networking platforms that we actually have. Probably some of you recognize this. Nice one actually in here is anybody ever use the multi-OS Viral? Anybody use Viral at all? Any network engineers? Yep. Have you used Viral? Yep. Just locally or just by yourself, is it? Yep, whatever. So this is quite a neat one. We recently put this one out, and what it does, so we have to think of what type of users do we have out there. We may have novice network users, we may have advanced network users, or basically medium range users. So as part of this, what we do is we provide preloaded configurations that people can actually use then. So the whole idea of the sandbox thing is when people log in is to make it as simplified as possible. So you might go in and say, don't know anything about Viral. What is it? I'll talk about it later. We do an instruction page, and what it'll do is we can preload configuration files for you, so it's all preloaded and ready to run. If you're a more advanced user, you can actually fire it up and actually run directly Viral itself and whatever. So for example, if you wanted to do some sort of network devs operation, what would happen if I do this in my production environment? This is the ideal platform that you could actually do that, whatever. So that gives people more focus, because as you know yourself, not a good idea deploying stuff live on a production environment. This way it gives you basically a test platform to do that. I will show you more in the catalog or whatever. Another one that's of use is particularly the iOS XR service provider, particularly the iOS XR 9K. Quite expensive to buy. Again, we actually provide that. A lot of the programmability that we actually do in terms of netconf and everything on the iOS XE. Most of our labs, just mentioned, I mentioned this later on, are actually VM based. The reason they're VM based is because we can actually scale it. We traditionally have some hardware labs that we can actually do, but the emphasis is trying to make it as scalable as possible. So that's the thing, whatever. Meraki is another thing. We just recently put some labs in that. Some of them are software, but most of them basically are hardware based. Cisco DNA. CMX, streaming telemetry. That just gives you a flavor of what the networking environments, whatever. Any questions? So far, so good. Okay, just in terms of data center, I'm not going to go through all of these and things. What I worked on was the Open NOx then, basically Nexus 9, and we do some of the Nexus 9K on Viral. So all this is really do is just to give you a sort of a flavor of what we actually currently have in the environment. SCI, and then we have some sort of UCS environment. So there's plenty actually here to, talk about, and plenty actually to work with, Okay. Just recently, I was involved in Cisco Kinetic. We worked with the business unit, things like Fog Network Director, Eximprod. We recently put those basically on the Sandbox platform. Again, people said, well, what is it? What does it do? This is the way that we actually get people involved. Some IOX platforms that we actually have on there too, maybe show those later on when we actually do a deep dive. So that's growing obviously in terms of numbers. Okay, some cloud-based stuff. What we have is just recently put SD-WAN on that. And again, some Contiv, Kubernetes, some ACI stuff and whatever. Some of this stuff I obviously learning about myself, but we try to basically encompass as much as actually as a BU provides then. Okay, just some analytics and automation. Basically, all this is just a network traffic generator. So some people come back and say, that's very nice, I don't really want to run a traffic generator at my own environment. Do you have anything that would actually allow us to do that? Again, you can reserve a sandbox lab, and actually we'll talk about it in more detail, but we actually have this type of product. Again, all these products are dependent on the BU updates, so as BU updates come in, we actually just update them accordingly. Open source stuff, DevBox is a useful one because people say, well, if you're from a developer background, do you have Python installed, do you have all these applications installed? So what we do is we do customized boxes to give people a chance then actually to play around. So the whole idea is to make it as easy as possible for you guys in terms of actually using the technology, because otherwise, if you have to go and build your own box and you're doing your daytime job, it's obviously quite difficult to do that. Some security stuff, so probably where, we Cisco API, firepower obviously is the main component in here. In some of the cases with the firepower, we actually basically have a hardware-based lab for that because obviously the nature of the technology. Some people maybe want to in terms of evaluate how that technology is. We have the capacity to do that. Things like Project Joy is basically a network analysis tool. People want to know is what's happening on my network, what's the traffic shaping profile, whatever. People use that quite extensively to get a flavor. And again, this is good because if you have to go and buy a product and you want the money for it, you have to justify it. So this is useful for terms of evaluating any technology and then said, yeah, that would probably fit into my scheme of things, and that would be probably the thing to do then. So that's just, I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's just really just to give you a flavor of actually what we have. And we'll have a look at the catalog in more detail. Quite an extensive amount on collaboration. The demand from the user community is to have a lot of sequential versioning because people like to work on these particular types of version. Originally, the sandbox came from a collaboration point of view, so our initial deployments in terms of sandboxes actually were in terms of the collaboration space. A lot of stuff in terms of obviously WebEx meetings is one we just recently integrated in, and RoomKits is another one that one of my colleagues was involved in, and again a lot on the collaboration space then whatever. So rather than me going through each one of these things, probably after this, once I do a wrap up, I'll point you to all where these directions are or whatever. Okay, so that's just give you a flavor of what we actually have, and in terms of the technologies. Any questions at that point? Is that making sense so far? Nobody lost? Yes? Sorry, what's that again? We're just going to cover that. So the question there from the colleague there was, how do we do real reservations? So we're actually just going to come on to that point. What we're going to do is talk about actually how we do that. And then what I'm hoping, internet permitting and there's no issues, we'll actually take you through a live demo and actually have time to do that. So that's what we're going to do. All right. So just going to talk a bit about sandboxes, talk about the catalog, and then as I say, I'm going to try and do a live demo. I've got some reservations made, but again, it's pretty much dependent on the infrastructure speed then. So people have asked me, okay, so I've got a sandbox and I've got technology, right? What do I want to do with it, right? People might say, I have no idea what this actually is. Or you might get the advanced user that says, I specifically want something to do. So for example, there's what we term as an always-on sandbox. Always-on in the sense that it's actually instant access. So if you go onto the sandbox catalog and actually select any always-on sandbox lab, right, you can actually get IP connectivity to that environment, be it browser access, SSH, or any other mechanism, right? The nice thing about it is instant access. You don't have to start and say, okay, do I have to spin this up or do access time? It's actually available there. And the good thing that we find for a lot of people is some people like VPN, others don't. So what we do is we provide this publicly available on our sandbox. So you can go and access this actually now straight from the catalog. There's no administrative access. You can probably understand why that's the case, because obviously it's essentially a shared environment. So in order to give people a look at it, for example, we might have an iOS XE netconf always on lab on. So we obviously don't want somebody going in there with obviously root privileges and messing up for other people. So we have to restrict it in terms of the access. So it's an idea to give people an idea of what the technology is actually like, but without breaking it for everybody else. And so that's the design that we actually do in that. And then again, it's if you want to say, okay, say I'm doing something on netconf and I want to try that, what does it actually do? This is a way of actually having a go then. So it's quite useful from the point that you just want to get a flavor of the actual technology. So that's one type of level up, and we'll have a look at that actually in the presentation. Now, the more interesting one probably from your guys' perspective is a reservation-based lab. So the common question that people ask said, yeah, it's great technology, but I want full access to it. I want to be able to do something that I couldn't traditionally do on my production environment, right? So when we reserve a lab, and we'll talk about this in more detail, right, it's basically a private environment. Private in the sense that it's only you that actually has exclusive access to that environment, because obviously you don't want anybody else actually in there at the moment. And then the other thing is okay, so I've got full administrative access, but what can I do here? Again, full administrative rights to every lab. So for example, if you had an iOS router in there, it's full basically admin access. If you had basically a Windows machine, again, it's full administrative access. So everything has got essentially full access to that environment. And that's what people want. People want to be able to actually do things, whatever. Now, the only thing is, and we mentioned back on the Always On Lab, right, it's publicly accessible on the internet. With this, you can imagine it requires a reservation, because we need to essentially spin up the resources. So from your perspective, all you do is actually reserve it. We actually do all the background work in terms of actually spinning up the environment. So what that does, right, now obviously since it's a private environment, that necessarily entails VPN connectivity. Now, some people like VPN connectivity, others don't, but at the moment, in terms of the technology that we actually have, that's the way that we actually have to do it. And again, it's primarily used if you want to develop and test against that. Whereas the always on one is just, yeah, that works, that API call works and whatever. But if you want to do some really serious stuff, this is actually where we need to go. So just in summary, two types of labs. There's the always on one, which again is shared environment. That allows you just basically to get a flavor of the actual technology. But for more deep dive in terms of reservation based lab, that's what it actually does, whatever. Is that clear to everyone? Does everybody get an idea of what that actually is? So you can see the pattern, and again, this is all based on user feedback. This is what you guys actually want, because traditionally we would have just said, well, there's the always on technology, off you go. So, well, I want to do a bit more. This is actually how we do it then, whatever. So that's good. So key takeaway from this here is two types of lab, always on, and basically a reservation-based lab. So far, so good, making sense? It's okay? Okay, so I just did a quick screenshot here. This is what the catalog looks like when you go to, and again, we'll do this later on when we go into developer.cisco.com sandbox. This is the type of interface that you would actually see with. So, again, you could probably, you can see when we'll talk about this here, you've got like reserve tile, and then you have basically an always on then. So you know specifically what type of environment that you're actually going to get. You can see there's an extensive list. We try to, and again, this is based on user experience. Like if you go in and say, okay, I want collaboration, I want security. If you have to deep dive within 76 tiles, it gets confusing. So the idea is we try as much as possible to color code the sandbox labs to make it easy to use. And again, this is ever evolving and this is ever changing, right? Basically based on your guys' requirements. So for example, anything in the light blue, we would actually classify that as networking. Anything that you actually see in the red is basically security. Something there in terms of the green would be actually just something like blockchain. And again, anything got to do with data center would be in the purple. So this is just based on feedback, make it easy. How do we actually do it? I want to know if it's always on, I want to know if it's reserved, and what type of technology am I actually getting. So that's really what we're trying to capture in that one. In some cases, we got actually basically a demo label at the top. due to the restrictions of the technology, sometimes they're only available actually in demo mode. And again, that's very much a business unit dependency that we've actually have to integrate. But for the most part, we're able to actually to bring in the full environment. All right. So what I mentioned, again, more information in terms of, so in order to keep you guys up to date, so you may be something like Nexus 9K, viral, collaboration version, security version. What you need to know from an easy perspective is like what version. There's no point actually in going to an always-on lab if it's not actually the right version that you actually want to utilize. What is the technology? Is it networking, collaboration, security? And again, is it easy? What is an always-on or reservation-based lab? So this has worked quite well from a point of view of user feedback. People like this type of interface and they know exactly what they're getting. Does that make sense, or did everybody get the idea? And again, easy to identify, easy to use the technology, so that's what we're trying to drive at. So far so good? Okay, so just to, again, from a screenshot perspective, just to show you what an always-on lab looks like. Again, I just picked this one for Cisco DNA Center. So again, based on user feedback, what people like is, well, certainly from my own perspective, I like to see a visual diagram of actually what I'm getting. I like to see, you know, what's the node type, you know, does it have any sort of IP addressing in it, what type of technology it actually is. So this works quite well. So, you know, you've got essentially a series of devices, you've got how they're connected, and the other thing is too then, from that perspective is, we usually keep in here just to remind you that it's basically a non-reservation based lab. So that's this instant access. Overview is very important. Again, people go in and say, okay, what is it? You know, what type of technology? What does it actually do? And then what can the developer do in this particular lab? You know, what he's permitted to do and what he's not permitted to do then, whatever. Again, heading at the top, tell you that it's a sandbox lab. Obviously, I'm just logged in. It tells you, obviously, domain. I'm obviously just logged in as that user. And again, a pictorial representation of actually what it is. So far, so good? Makes sense? All right? Yep.
Do we need to reserve each of these individually, how everything comes together? For example, if I need to reserve DNA with different switches, different routers, do I need to choose each of them?
No, we pre-provision it. So the question is there, just from the colleague, and we're coming on to that, is when you reserve a lab, can you actually choose the devices? If I understand correctly, choose devices. What we do is we pre-configure a particular spun-up environment for that, right? So it's basically a topology based. We spin up what topology is actually based there. So you don't have the option to choose particular devices. Yeah, mainly because it's difficult for us to scale, so we have to give essentially, you know, a more or less an all-inclusive environment. But we'll be coming on to that anyway. We'll talk about that. Okay, a more interesting one in terms of reservation-based lab is, again, it tells you what you actually get. Now, in that particular case, you can't really add it. Now, you can add devices on the VPN, but effectively the router environment you get is actually as pre-configured as there. Important information, right, in terms of overview of what it actually does. Tells you nice, actually, in terms of what basic topologies you actually are going to get when you actually select this. And also what we find is that we try to keep up to the latest revision levels of all the Cisco iOS code, iOS XR and Nexus 9K and whatever. So this is actually probably one of our most popular labs because it gives access to everything that actually people want. And then from a point of view of, we'll talk about a reservation button, it shows you actually what type, and then we include in those basically a development box, because people come along and said, okay, got all this environment working, but how do I run Python? How do I do some tools? How do I use GitHub? We've pre-configured a lot in a development box. You don't have to worry about getting GitHub updates or running Python. We've it all inclusive in it. It was termed a development box. So try to make it as easy as possible. Again, I'll hopefully show you this in a couple of minutes. So the most important thing that you probably need to know from this is, how do we reserve a lab? Because what you want to know from this, you don't want to be listening to me all day, is how you actually go and reserve a lab. How easy is it to do, right? So user makes a reservation, right? So user goes out and said, select one of those essentially reservation-based lab. The reservation begins. Now, if you can imagine, and most of our environment, in fact, almost exclusively, is VM-based. If I make a reservation, what do you think is going to happen? How long do you think it'll take up, typically, if it's a VM-based, based on an ESXi platform? Any idea? Yeah, 5 minutes. Now, if it's 5 minutes, it depends if it's a simplified topology, like if it's only 2 VMs. But for a larger topology, for example, like viral with a lot of things or whatever, the spin-up time in that actually can be quite significant. So typically, in terms of a simplified technology, it can be like 5 minutes. To a more advanced technology, it could be anything from 10 to 15 minutes. People find that reasonably okay, you know. If it goes longer than 15 minutes, people say, well, that's just too long, you know, whatever. So we're working to actually enhance that for some of our particular labs. The lab is provisioned, right? So what you'll see is, you'll see in terms of your interface, it'll tell you at the lab. So what the lab provision means is it's done things like spun up the VMs, it's provisioned IP addressing, it's actually configured everything that you actually need to have, and the lab is effectively ready. We use a product called Cloud Shell, and Cloud Shell basically is a lab provisioning tool that actually spins up the required technologies. Now, since it's, if you remember back in terms of the basically reservation-based lab, it's a private environment. So private environment usually entails like a VPN contact. So the important thing is, you get an email that actually is sent with the VPN credentials. And once you get that email, effectively, you can actually log into that environment. And that environment is yours to do anything you actually want with. Again, full administrative access and full access to anything you want. User does a VPN connection. I don't know what your experience actually with is, but sometimes that can be a little bit problematic, but for the most part, it's fine. And as I say, you have full access to the lab then. Where full access means complete. You don't worry about not breaking it, because if you do break something, we actually clean all this down. As part of our lab provisioning system, we basically baseline all of this again. So don't worry about, oh, I broke something or I did something, whatever. It all gets broken down. So again, when I mean full minutes of access, it's entirely to you guys. Does that make sense in terms of how it actually is, right? Good thing about it is, and I did mention about it, did mention you get a development box with it. So if you want to do something in terms of running any simulation or tools, you get session sharing. So as part of the reservation setup, you can actually add a number of additional users if you want them to actually to share your session. And then you can actually, get some stuff. So part of what the dev box does, normally we include, if you're wanting any updates, we normally have little scripts that run the dev box that actually pull stuff down from GitHub repositories and upload them on your actual development. So try to make it as easy as possible. Okay, so now this is going to be the fun part, right? So I'm going to actually just attempt to show you, actually I've got some screenshots and we attempt to actually do terms of reservation. So if you just bear with me a second. So in this one, I've actually brought up, I just reserved this morning, and what you can see is it's telling me that the reservation is active. So basically I've got an active reservation. It's actually provided me VPN credentials, and it tells me how much time I've actually got left in terms of the reservation. Can anybody spot actually how it would increase the reservation time? Don't have to answer, just see if anybody's paying attention. How would it increase the reservation time? Clue is it's close to the active icon. See it up here? Just a little plus sign up at the top. So what you can do is, by default you get, I believe you get 12 hours reservation time. That's the actual default time. But you can actually increase that up to 7 days. So that's the max. Now, obviously we can't go more above 7 days, because if we give everybody unlimited time, then nobody else will get any other reservations. The little hand symbol there, you might decide, okay, well, I've had enough of doing this in terms of environment. I can actually stop the reservation. So it's full flexibility. And then in terms of the lab information, gives you an overview. It tells you actually what to do. Now, I'm going to attempt actually to So this reservation is actually active in San Jose at the moment, right? I've basically spun up 3 VMs, requested that be spun up, and 2 of them, one is a fog director, and the other's 2 IX CAF nodes. So that's basically an active live reservation running on a data center in San Jose at the moment. So I'm just going to do a quick, just like a quick HTTP in it, just to prove that it is actually valid. So all I've done for that is, and if you notice when I actually was doing it, I didn't do a direct HTTP connection. I actually used the icon drop-down. So what we've done is we built a thing called a Guacamole server. And what that does, it allows people actually to initiate either a HTTPS connection or it actually able to do an SSH. So some people have come back and said, well, it'd be nice actually rather than having to do HTTP, do this. So we've incorporated a lot of this type of functionality actually into it. So again, that's just something there where, I just run up basically an IOX local manager. You can actually upload applications. So that's actually live as we actually speak. And again, I have full administrative access to that particular device and I can actually do any with them. Now, if I actually go back, what I can actually do then is, you see it's actually 18 hours and 12 minutes. I just would have mentioned actually what I can do is I can actually go in there and extend that. So I can actually basically bump that up another day and extend that reservation then up to a limit essentially of 7 days. And you can see basically it's extended successfully. What you can do then in terms, I did talk about, if you want to see in terms of things actually done up, this is when I spun up the lab. It tells you actually that basically what it does, there's an environment driver there. It actually essentially powers everything up. And it told me that the interesting thing to note here is that it tells me how long it's going to actually take and what VPN credential information I got. So I just literally set up a Google account and basically give me a VPN head-in address, and essentially I log in those credentials. So I'm actually logged in there at the moment, just VPN connectivity and actually accessing that actually device. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, just one thing that I'll show you in here is what I would do is I would encourage you actually to go to developer.cisco.com/sandbox and actually try this actually out for yourself. You can see there I've actually got I've got 2 reservations there at the moment. I've actually got collaboration and IOX running there at the moment, and I can actually access those multiply. So that's all particular environment. Tells me what's actually there, and then you've got this type of tile in here is, what's the current reservations, what do you actually have, is it a start? Now in some cases be scheduled where we actually run out of capacity, and it'll tell you actually if it's a scheduled application. Any questions out of that? Does that make sense? Again, it's just very much touching the surface, right? What I encourage you to do is actually register an account and actually try this out for yourself. Just one more thing to show. We did mention the Sandbox Labs, so while we actually have it here. And again, you can see this was the actual environment that I actually showed you before, but what you can do is you can actually browse by category. So for example, I want to do all the networking. You can actually go in there. And this just brings up all the networking devices. If you want to just basically filter on, for example, just always on labs, you can actually do that. So it's very intuitive as to what you actually want to do then. So that's just, I just to show you how to make a reservation, how to actually, very simple access in terms of the sandbox, and essentially credential information. But I say again, I encourage you actually to go ahead and do this. I'm just running a little bit out of time, but I just need to catch up on the last bit. So thankfully that little demo worked okay for you. It's just really just to give you a flavor. So I did mention in terms of Sandbox at your event. So the Sandbox team is actually all over here at the moment. And again, there's plenty to do there in terms of a competition to do for that. What a lot of people ask for is said, okay, that's great and it's great for me, right? But what happens if I got a classes of users? Say I've got like 20 people who want to use a collaboration lab, 20 people who want to use, for example, multi-OS viral. I want to actually run a classroom for myself. May want to do a hackathon where I've actually got people doing coding. I want them to access all this environment. How do I actually go ahead and do that? And then exploration sessions, just want to figure out the technology. What is it all about? How do I actually do it? So what we do there is, as part of that, we can actually engage with you. If you want to actually, rather than just doing one reservation by yourself, we can actually do what's termed in terms of bulk registration. So in other words, you might have a university that might have a class of coding people, or you might have a particular development forum that you want to exit. So this is how we do it, and this has proven quite popular. A lot of people have come and said, hey, I need 20 reservations, I need them by this period of time, what can you do for me? And again, we have support forums, and we can do this sort of bulk registration for you. So rather than just specifically for yourself, we can actually provide that for you. So that's a useful feature that actually people like. And again, you don't have to worry about anything. The thing, if you're doing a class, what's the most important thing? Even when I was preparing for this, is like, is my PC working? Will it boot up? You know, do I get an IP address? Do I get internet connectivity? So what we do from this here, we pre-provision everything for you, and we validate it to make sure that it's working for you. So that's part of the service. And then for your attendees, we do basically a simple procedure so we can exit. So we get these bulk registrations, like, for example, sales team want to do some sort of programming. What's the instructions, guys? How to do it? You don't have to worry about the background. Is that okay? It makes sense? Just show it's more flexibility. And again, I'm not going to read this, just running a little bit out of time, but this is some of the feedback that we actually got on the Sandbox. You know, people have actually gone ahead and used this and said, you know, this is great because we didn't have to use this on our production environment, and we were able to actually to validate stuff. So this is probably something that you guys probably would be interested in. I'm not going to obviously read this out. I'll just let you glance at it. So that just brings us nicely to the wrap up. So the key thing to take away from this session, right, if you don't take anything else, it's a free 24-hour service to all Cisco technology. So if that's the only thing you remember, that's what it's actually about, and that's what we do. So that can't be too bad. Instant access to hosted environments, so you can easily explore all the various technologies. And again, it's accessible from any web device that you actually so desire. Typically, you know, obviously since I'm a Cisco employee, I've used my Cisco ID, but you can there actually use Google, use Facebook. There's multiple ways of actually accessing it. And again, emphasize, again, it's a bit of marketing on my behalf, it's a free and self-service environment. So that makes the key differential in terms of doing that. And again, the very important address, if you get an opportunity, and again, you can go over there on my right, is developer.cisco.com Sandbox. What we do from the Sandbox perspective is provide the hosting environment for all the Cisco technologies, and we provide you access to that. You can read about it, but how do we get access? That's what we do. Okay, just some other quotes. I'm not gonna read those out. But again, this is the feedback that we actually got. We obviously didn't make this up ourselves, but people have actually come back and said, this is what we actually had to do. How DevNet actually helps, how Sandbox actually helps, and actually how in terms of solving problems. So I'll give you a little second to read it, just to glance at it. So that's some of the feedback that we actually got. Okay, some other quotes. Again, just to give an idea that I'm not just sort of blowing my own trumpet, but this is effectively some of the feedback that we got actually from the end users. I'll give you a second to look at that. And again, people like them from an event success point of view. my event really went really well. So that gives us good feeling, and obviously the end person's good feeling or whatever. Again, this is just mandatory. We have to say this in terms of complete your online sourcing survey. So I'm sure you know how to do that. And I'm just about out of time. And again, WebEx Teams there if you obviously want to do that. And again, important thing is, can't emphasize too importantly, developer.cisco.com/sandbox. Want to play with real sandbox? We're just over there in the corner, and you can meet all the guys of the extra sandbox team. Sorry, I'm just literally out of time. Sorry. Thank you very much.